Morning, everyone. As Alessandro kindly introduced me, Chris Hodson. So I work for a company called ZSCALER. ZSCALER are the world's largest security as a service cloud platform. Put that in perspective, we see about 25 billion HTTP transactions on a daily basis, 15 million customers, users rather, in 5,000 organisations. So we're going to talk today about some of the myths of cloud computing, going to debunk some of these myths. So we're all kind of acutely aware of some of the benefits of cloud, but what are some of the risks of cloud, and do they still apply today? So this is a bit about me. As I said, I work for ZSCALER. This is my first role, I suppose we would say, the dark side of the vendor world. So I spent 18 years in end-user organisations. I know a few familiar faces in the room from roles gone by, and these are certainly some of the challenges or some of the myths that I've seen personally, and I think certainly cloud technology has moved on, and I'd like to discuss some of those points, and ideally, Alejandro, we'll have some time for some questions as we move through this. So the first thing was, what is a myth? So I looked at this, and I'll be honest with you, we decided to do a deck on the myths of cloud computing. And for me, a myth, and this was an extract from online, a traditional story explaining a natural or a social phenomenon involving supernatural beings or events. And I thought to myself, well, cloud isn't really that. There's something supernatural. You know, another connotation of a myth is it in some way religious. Doesn't fit that kind of bracket either. So for anyone who listens to Radio 2 and Steve writes, you don't know what a factoid is. So an item of unreliable information that's reported and repeated so often that people accept that it's fact. And for me personally, I feel that's a lot more where we are with cloud computing and some of the things we've heard before. So a great part of my job is I get to do some research in concentric circles, shall we say. So I've had a look around and kind of put together some interesting factoids to kind of set the scene. So first one I had here is cracking your knuckles apparently leads to arthritis, which isn't true. That's a factoid. It's actually the displacement of air between ligaments in the skin. Another factoid we hear quite a lot is the Great Wall of China is the only man-made object visible from space. It's actually not particularly easy to see the Great Wall of China from space. The Apollo astronauts tried it on a low Earth orbit, and it's not particularly clear. One I'm embarrassed to say that I thought was true. Deoxygenated blood isn't blue. The reason deoxygenated blood looks blue, it's the skin and the fat. So these are things that we've heard and we've been taught, along with the swimming example that we get told as a child. We get told don't swim for an hour after eating, because in some way it's dangerous. The only thing particularly dangerous is obviously alcohol associated with swimming, but for very different reasons. And the final one we get told, or we have been told, I'm interested to your kind of thoughts on this, is that cloud computing is insecure. So is that true? Is that something we can say as black and white as cloud is insecure? So for me, cloud's a nebulous concept. If we don't define specifically what cloud is, the model, the way that we're accessing this data, it shouldn't be our primary consideration when we're applying security controls. As NIST quite rightly say here, it's a model for enabling ubiquitous access, shared services. Multi-tenancy, although NIST don't have multi-tenancy as a cloud essential characteristic, the Cloud Security Alliance certainly do. And in my view, it's certainly a core component as well. I like to think of cloud, it's kind of like the same analogy we use for a road. So a set of controls that we would have for an autobahn or a freeway, the requirements around speed limits, the requirements around policy and safety measures, that would be very different for the security controls considerations you'd apply for, let's say, a dusty backstreet lane. This kind of one-size-fits-all wouldn't be appropriate for safety controls of a road. So why should we have that very kind of polarised view of what's appropriate for cloud? And I think something that's going to be a repeating theme in these 10 myths or these 10 factoids that we run through are around roles and responsibilities. Because we talk quite extensively about the people, process and technology of information security. Well, nowhere more than cloud is that appropriate. You know, the requirements if you have a SaaS platform that's delivered to you out of the box compared to an infrastructure as a service, almost bare metal platform that you're provisioning and patching, the requirements are very different. And I think sometimes we're very good at talking about the technology of cloud, but we sometimes forget the people and the process side of things, the requirements, procurement, contracts, non-functional requirements. I know I have exactly half an hour today, so I'll crack straight on with these 10 cloud myths. And these are kind of, from my experience, these are things that I've heard in the industry. People talk to me, they've changed somewhat over the years, but I still hear every single one of these at some point in time. Number one is we don't really use cloud. Now, that may be becoming less and less of an issue, but I still hear this. And it's kind of analogous to me as the example we talk about in our industry about data breaches. So when we talk about data breaches, we say there's those organisations who've been breached and there's those organisations who don't know that they've been breached. And kind of the same thing goes for cloud in my eyes. There's those organisations who are consuming cloud services and there's those who don't know that they are. A recent RightScale survey said 95% of organisations are in some way running infrastructure as a service, either in production systems or in some form of proof of concept. We also have exactly the same with our applications that are going to the cloud. So we've got Office is going to Office 365. We have lots of organisations running with Google Apps. We're seeing Siebel being replaced with Salesforce. We're seeing Oracle HR being replaced with Workday. We are using cloud, and we as security people need to be seen to be the department of yes, or that no but no. We need to educate our users. We can't be the ones who are blocking access. But equally, we need the visibility. So it's very important that we consume cloud services, but again, that these people, process and technology components are understood and delivered. Second one, I hear, this is probably one I hear the most, I think. I lose control of my data when it goes to the cloud. And I don't really see why, because location isn't really your key factor for security. Now, location, I'm sure there'll be questions on this, but location is very important when we look at the legal and the regulatory side of things. But it's not an important security consideration. If you have controls in place aligned to the classification of your data, why does it matter if it's in a data center local to your data center down the road or in, for example, Azure or in AWS? If you park the legal and the regulatory considerations, which need to be thought of and need to be considered, location isn't the primary consideration. Two things that are, though, very clearly, are data portability and kind of the risk of obsolescence. So if you are going to consume a cloud service, you need to, again, it's back to that process side of things we talked about earlier, but you need to make sure that you can understand how to get that data out of that cloud service provider at any point in time. If you're using a proprietary platform, how are you going to get that data out, for example, in the very rare likelihood of a breach, or you decide to go with another cloud provider? How do you get that data out? So portability is key. Cloud is less secure than on-prem solutions. So fewer people are telling me this over the years, but I'm still hearing it now. And I've added a number of companies there, companies of different sizes, different industries, but they all have one kind of common theme or one thing in common, and that's they've all been breached, and they all have local services as it stands at the moment. And the causes of those breaches were very different, but they were certainly no different if they were in cloud. So admin credentials being stolen in the example of JP Morgan that I've got up there, RAM scraping for Home Depot, third-party access for Target. It doesn't matter, but these are on-premise solutions that have in some way been owned. I'm at the mercy of cloud vendors for patching. It's a bit of a strange one, but one I've heard on more than one occasion in some way, that cloud service providers are the only people using, for example, open source software. Patching is an organisation's responsibility. I would argue, in fact, that the benefits of cloud from your security perspective are that these guys are the guys who are incentivised to be deploying patches. Security is a core component of the cloud service provider. If there's a breach of a cloud service provider, it's their day-to-day business. I talk to a lot of you guys around, everyone from supermarkets to trading organisations. And your core business is selling beans or trading stocks and shares. It's not having best-of-breed information security and having to water and feed these appliances. So there are actual benefits, I believe, from a cloud perspective when we start to look at the maintenance and the patching of these systems. Another one we have here around appliances provide greater control over scalability and performance. Now, I've been in a number of organisations where we've been looking at infrastructure requirements, we've been looking at business continuity, scale and performance of everything from a CRM system to an e-commerce platform. And what do we do when we have appliances? We scale them to the busiest time of the year. So if, for example, you're a retailer or a payment processor and Black Friday and Cyber Monday are extremely busy for you guys, you scale your appliances accordingly. Now, it might be they're only hot for 2 days out of 365, but that's the consideration you have to take into account. You have to build these appliance architectures to cope with your busiest periods. And the same goes for the security threat landscape. as a new threat comes out or as the increase in TLS that we're seeing, you buy more and more of these appliances, stacking them in each of your data centers, and you have this unwieldy mess of boxes, a pizza box architecture, as I've been calling it recently. And as we're seeing more and more traffic being encrypted over TLS, I think Google released some stats last week saying 2/3 of all web pages that they see now are in some way SSL or TLS inspected. Sandvine had a report early on in the year, their 2016 report said 60% of fixed line traffic in EMEA is now SSL or TLS inspected. So what are we doing with those appliances? We're building more and more on top of each other. Kind of leading on from that is a point around cloud in some way being more difficult to manage. And I think this goes back to my second point around visibility. So if cloud is more difficult to manage, I don't really buy that one. If you have a cloud service provider, and certainly if you're applying your security in the cloud, it gives you that opportunity for a best-of-breed platform as opposed to a set of point solutions. So in a lot of organisations I've been involved with, we've built best-of-breed architectures. But those best-of-breed architectures have been at a componentised level. So you'd have a Gartner top-right IPS, you'd have a Gartner top-right web proxy, you'd have God knows what doing your TLS inspection. The aggregation and consolidation of information from those platforms is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult to patch and maintain and sustain all of those systems. Invariably, you have different teams of people with different skill sets looking at each of these platforms. So I would argue quite the opposite from a cloud security perspective. I would say cloud is actually considerably easier to manage. Cloud resources, in fact, Alessandro, I'm sure this is one we'll debate in a moment. Cloud resources are more exposed to attack. So that's kind of predicated on the fact that you know who has access to your systems and in some way that you can control access to those systems. So I'm sure we don't need to do a straw poll, but I'm pretty confident everyone in this room has some form of VPN access into their environment for their end users. I'm quite sure there is some form of third-party access coming into some DMZ. We have a number of systems that are sat there listening from the internet because the business has demanded we have this almost ubiquitous level of access. Access anywhere from any device, any location, requires us to open up our firewalls and our IPS devices to allow this traffic into our data center. Another point on that, both Verizon and Forrester in recent risk reports have identified insider threat being a much bigger and greater risk to the organisation than any kind of malicious external threat actor. So this view that cloud resources are more exposed to attack, I would kind of challenge that. I would say, yes, obviously they are on the internet, but also these cloud service providers invest the time. They have carrier-grade security. There's a higher chance from a breach perspective that data will be encrypted, that they'll have a defence-in-depth stack. A lot of SME organisations, there are significant financial kind of cutbacks in organisations at the moment, and we're making do with what we have. So cloud resources are on the internet, but I would challenge in this world of almost zero trust and cloud services and the kind of erosion and moving of our perimeter, that we're all on the internet in some way. At least from a CSP perspective, we have the opportunity to apply that higher grade of security. Multi-tenant clouds expose privacy concerns. So I'm a geek at heart, and I've done some investigation into different types of hypervisors and proof of concept code that exists, and the ability to have a rootkit in a layer 0 hypervisor that can compromise a set of virtual machines. I'm not going to argue that doesn't happen, but if we actually contextualize some of the risks that we've talked about today, if I'm going to try and own someone's virtual machine, I'm going to be looking at their admin credentials. I'm going to be looking at their network routing. Multi-tenancy is the basis and the foundation that we have for cloud today. It's the reason that organisations are getting these efficiency benefits, these elasticity benefits. So we can't ignore the fact that we need multi-tenancy to achieve those magnitudes of scale. So all CIOs that we have here today or in the room, they're going to be demanding the use of these efficient cloud services, be it infrastructure as a service, be it software as a service. So we require multi-tenancy. So I just ask that when you're looking from a risk assessment perspective at the dangers or risks of going cloud, really try and contextualise what is a greater risk. If I'm a bad guy on the internet, I'm much more likely to be looking at compromising credentials or having a go at your management plane or doing something down that route as I am trying to install some, root level kit into some form of hypervisor appliance. Cloud vendors lack transparency. Some do. I hear this quite a lot, and certainly my experience of cloud from the end user perspective. But I would challenge that the best of breed cloud providers that we have today have kind of changed that model. The consumers are requiring more. Security is an embedded requirement from a business perspective. So if your cloud vendor isn't providing transparency, the learning from this, and this isn't a myth, the learning from this is you're using the wrong cloud vendor. You shouldn't be accepting what you're being told. If this is a black box solution that you're getting and you're not comfortable, you need to move providers. If a provider doesn't tell you where they're storing your information, you need to move providers. The good guys out there, the example I've given here, funnily enough, is from trust.zscaler.com. So this identifies from our 108 data centers around the world which nodes are up, where there have been issues, SLA considerations. Salesforce does exactly the same thing, funnily enough. It isn't an issue, I don't think, necessarily with cloud. If there's a lack of transparency, that's the people and the process side of things we talked about earlier when we looked at the IaaS, PaaS, and software as a service. And the final one I'll run through today, and we'll put this to the floor, is that appliances are in some way more reliable than cloud. I hear this quite a lot. Well, again, back to this core business discussion that I started earlier. If we're offline, or if Salesforce are offline, or if Office is offline for 15 minutes, that's a very serious business implication. That's something that will reverberate around the world and be in mainstream media. But what happens if one of your appliances, let's say a router breaks in your data center? I've been in that situation, and I've been on the IT side when we've had those platinum or gold relationships with our appliance vendors. No one's getting that back online in 15 minutes. The quickest turnaround you're going to get on an appliance getting shipped to your data center is 4 hours? I'd say roughly, certainly from my experience of this world, it's around 4 hours. So I challenge that certainly, that appliances are in some way more reliable than cloud. We have distributed architecture. Again, in our case, as I said, 108 data centers around the world. Most large SaaS providers or security as a service providers have that architecture. To say in some way appliances are more reliable, I would disagree with that. And certainly in the light of a lot of the distributed denial of service we've seen these days as well, there's certainly that high availability consideration for cloud over appliances as well. So I kind of put together kind of a few closing points before we kind of put the floor to questions. You can't outsource accountability. So irrespective of using software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, sticking it in your own data center, putting it on your phone, I don't care. It's your data at the end of the day. Yes, you have a relationship with your data processor, but fundamentally, it's your responsibility to know where that data is going, both from a location perspective as on or off-prem, but also from a legal perspective, also knowing which jurisdictions your data is going to as well. Understand the responsibilities of subscriber and service provider. They do vary from SaaS through to IaaS. Who's doing the patching? Are you comfortable with the data that's being encrypted? A key point as well is around mapping your data flows. So how can you apply appropriate or commensurate security if you don't understand the sensitivity of your data that you're sending? So I hear people say, we don't use cloud for any of our confidential information. Well, in my view, if you take away the legal considerations of this, if you know what security controls from an architectural perspective you require for confidential information, why can't you use cloud? That's a question I kind of will put to the floor in a moment. So not all clouds are equal. Do your homework. So again, I've talked today about a number of best-of-breed clouds. There are cloud providers who won't give you their ISO 27001 certification. They won't tell you how they patch their platform. They won't tell you the versions of software they're running across their stack. Don't use those cloud providers. But also, if you have a bad experience with these particular CSPs, please don't think that we're all the same. And base your security controls on the sensitivity of your data. Don't base them on the location. My final kind of point on that. So I know we wanted to leave an awful lot of time. Yeah? Great stuff. So can I just put this to the floor on any of the questions or any of the challenges that you guys are seeing with cloud? I mean, the first thing that I would like to run through today, if you don't mind, is just sort of a show of hands on cloud consumption. So if it's infrastructure, platform or software, how many of you guys are kind of running production systems in cloud today, you say? Wow. Cool. Okay. I mean, that's certainly different than a view we would have got even kind of 2 or 3 years ago. And I don't know if anyone want to say or put their hands up and look at this. What would you say your main concerns, I presume we're broadly speaking security people in this room. What were the major challenges that you guys got when, you said we were going to move from data center X to a cloud service platform? Were there pushbacks from the business, or was it the business that was actually driving this for you guys?
The lack of pushback was my concern.
There wasn't any?
There wasn't any.
No?
It was purely business money wasn't it?
Wow, okay.
Just us,
Yeah? Great stuff. I mean, yeah, personally, I'm seeing that. So I'm hearing a lot of CIOs talking to me saying, we have this 2020 no data center strategy. We want everything in public cloud by those times. And again, to my point on architectural building blocks and components, that can be done. But I see a lot of organizations, unfortunately, who will take the cost margin of this is a cloud service without any security controls and kind of almost applying that backwards to what they have on-prem. So those costs don't ever actually equate to, I hate the apples for apples conversation, but that's kind of what we're looking at here. So let's say a cloud-based CRM platform costs X, my on-prem one costs magnitudes higher. By the time you've actually embedded and considered all the security controls you need in that CRM in the cloud, sometimes they're not quite as diametrically opposite as you would think. So that's been a big consideration for me. That kind of feeds into the shadow IT problem, I think, as well. So if you get a business unit, and this is a genuine risk with cloud, and to the point on process and people, the danger we have is it's so easy to provision cloud services these days. So examples, and I hope there aren't any marketing people in the room, kind of marketing and innovation teams generally, I've found in my experience, will go out, they'll get their credit card, they'll provision cloud services, and they'll start using it to store, customers, contacts, leads, whatever it is. That becomes a real challenge because you have that situation where you go in as a CISO and say, we're not saying you can't use cloud, but these are the considerations you need if this is confidential or secret information. It's very hard to layer on security retrospectively, I think. One of the challenges that I've found. So,
just facilitate them just a question.
Yeah.
The floor is totally open for questions. My experience on non-techie boards, people looking at cloud decisions, is that they have the analogy of the highway. They tend to be basically saying, guys, it's a highway compared to the normal road. They expect security to be higher than in a normal road, more maintenance. They are worried about the other guys driving in the same lane. That's totally true.
Mm-hmm.
But there is one concern is that when it goes wrong, it goes horrendously wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the fears I see in many of the people is, can we really trust on some of the fundamental functions to be outsourced on cloud?
Mm-hmm.
How do you answer these people? How do you address these people? They say that there are no IT native people,
Mm-hmm.
but there are poor people.
Yep.
And when you look at this, the cloud is big. And big
Mm-hmm.
sounds risky if it goes wrong.
Yeah. Again, I would say it goes back to having those kind of componentized security controls, genuinely speaking. So if you have a requirement to, and again, the business, in my opinion anyway, from experience, the business should be at a very policy-driven level, defining kind of, ideally anyway, some form of risk tolerance. So that organisation would say, we have to have in place ways to classify data, for example. We must have business continuity plans. And from those policies, kind of defining and articulating a set of security standards and a set of security patterns. And within that should be some form of, zoning model, cryptography standards that you would identify what you can do with what data, if that makes sense. So it sounds like what you're talking about is multi-tenancy and an overarching concern with multi-tenancy as a risk. And again, I've been quite open with the room. Yes, technically speaking, there are proof of concept exploits of being able to own and pop either a type 1 or a type 2 hypervisor. But compared to the risks of somebody stealing somebody's admin credentials or a web exploit kit which owns a 6-month-old version of Flash, it's about contextualizing that risk posture. That there is, I'm actually writing a thesis on this at the moment, that there is this kind of, in my view, irrational fear of cloud and a kind of concept of possession, which I think is, I don't know what you guys think, but of people like things being close to them anyway. So it is, I think, kind of a psychological angle on taking some of that stuff that's local to you and having it further away. But the risks associated with multi-tenancy, I think if you actually take a balanced view and a quantitative look at attacks that have been based on multi-tenancy, they are few and far between. It's much more likely you see the risks that we saw in Myth 3, which is an on-prem organisation. I remember the example from Home Depot when they got popped. They said, well, we sell hammers. It was kind of genuinely their response was, well, we don't do security. That's, how can we be to blame on this? So I think it's a risk-based decision. I think certainly that concept of shared ownership, the business benefits that we get from multi-tenancy, kind of considerably outweigh kind of the security risks, in my view.
I think it's interesting because I was hearing just now that this is being pushed back, but that's a problem. I think it kind of varies. So I'm working with PA Systems. We're a military defense company at core. They're so risk averse to the extent of I've got a smartphone, company provided, that has no internet access.
Mm-hmm.
So literally my browser is blocked. You click on a link, you go, oh, it's supposed to function somehow.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. There are you seeing quite a lot of companies that are risk averse in the sense of we're not even at a point where we are using Salesforce, I think we're using Hodson.
Yeah.
But we're not at a point where we kind of go, there's a value in using cloud because I think the business case is not even forming in some cases, and you look at it and you go, surely there is a value. There's an opportunity. There's cost savings involved. Yes, but from a risk-averse perspective, it's maybe there's not that much value there. It's quite interesting. It's the same, I think, for financial services organizations. I might be speaking or overstepping here because I'm not sure whom we've got in the room, but it's interesting because the security teams in financial services organizations would kind of go, maybe, yeah.
I've been there,
It's happening. I'm speaking to Swift now. They're basically going up. I don't think so. They really want to do some cloud bits, but we'd like to just monitor a bit closely what they access via the internet web browser. Thank you.
I agree. I think another consideration, and it's a really good point, is around some kind of, I suppose, legacy policy considerations. So I talk to a lot of government agencies, a lot of financial services organisations, who, irrespective of sometimes, and their words, not mine, kind of a pragmatic risk decision, there are sometimes policy documents that fundamentally say, today still, data will not leave an organisation's data centre. There are still regulatory controls from, I'm not going to name them, but in lots of different industries that haven't caught up, that are still saying you can't fundamentally take that data, irrespective of the controls you have in your data centre. I'm paraphrasing, but still, you can't take that data out. So that's certainly a challenge. I sit with CISOs and CIOs who say, we know the business benefits of doing this. We're hamstrung at the moment. We fundamentally can't. And to your other point there around business case, it's very occasionally, but I do speak to organisations where the cloud's no use to them. They are a single organisation in a single location, and their data centre architecture as it stands works perfectly well for them. But they are in a minority. I mean, again, BYO probably in most of your organisations is kind of an IT driver, presumably. I assume you have remote working. If you don't have localised breakout at all of your locations, I assume there's some form of consideration or strategy around software-defined networking, IWAN, some way of reducing MPLS costs. Those kind of things are, when I talk to the IT and the CIO side of things, they're the considerations they expect the security guy to almost overlay security controls onto. And then that's where you get back to that conversation of backhauling traffic. So again, there's a lot of guys here today, we can talk to you about what we do, but fundamentally that's the consideration we see, is that to get this best of breed security, everyone is taking their traffic from a remote office, rather than breaking it out to the internet, which would be the most efficient and the cheapest thing to do. They're having to backhaul all that traffic over MPLS to a data center somewhere in a big location in that region, sending the traffic out to the internet, back through the data center, back to the regional office, when the shortest path would be, well, I'm just going to talk to Salesforce that way. But because the organisations have got, no, thou must do this for security reasons, kind of goes that way. So there are different, we have challenges, or there are organisations who won't adopt cloud, not because the appetite isn't there, but they can't as it stands at the moment. And I think that also doesn't help that we have this kind of patchwork of security standards for cloud as well. There isn't that consistency.
Isn't the root cause problem there that we're trying to take an existing architecture? It goes back to your challenge number 2.
Yep.
We're trying to take an existing architecture and overlay,
definitely,
sticking plaster and bodge tape on top of it to make it work for either our modern organisations or the cloud.
Yeah.
And isn't actually what we should be doing to solve that is actually doing a proper architecture? going back to security architecture rather than security solutions.
Definitely. Yeah, no,
and then fixing it at root.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree with you. There's another talk I'm doing at the moment around kind of this whole kind of what do I call it? The perimeter isn't disappearing, it's moving. And in that we talk about that. We talk about kind of this whole castle and moat architecture that we used to use to kind of retrofit to the way that N-tier architectures worked. And yeah, there's a lot of talk in the architecture world about that at the moment. So Forrester's Zero Trust model advocates exactly that. It says when N-tier architecture was constructed, so for those who don't know, presentation, application, database, that model was very much a networking paradigm that we as security guys had to kind of fudge security controls around. Well, if we're in a world of the erosion of the perimeter and a perimeter in the cloud, we have to be in this world of zero trust. So this whole model of big fences and deep moats isn't working when our users are not having a requirement to come to the data center. They're using their mobile phones, they're going to cloud apps. So I completely agree with you, I think.
Yeah, except for Forrester thinking, they stole the concept from Jericho in
Yeah.
terms of zero trust,
Yeah.
and then came to one conclusion on how to solve it.
Yeah.
Okay, we can take that one offline. I mean,
I guess time-wise, we are done. We want to thank you, Christopher, for the lovely chat and the
thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.